Well, good morning to you all, and I'd like to start, if I may, where I left off last night. And those of you who didn't attend last night will have to catch up quite quickly. We had the film of Gods and Men, which is the story of Christian de Chergé. And Christian de Chergé was the prior of a community in Tiberine, Algeria, who was one of 7 who were martyred in 1997, I think, or 1996. But his writings have been very important from a monastic point of view. And in a little book that someone called Timothy Wright wrote, called No Peace Without Prayer, just to be provocative, there are a few quotes that I'd just like to, if I may, start with. This is Christian's spiritual theology. It is at the table of sinners that I learn best of all to become a sign of the promised mystery of the communion of saints. The multiplied loaves that we Christians and Muslims are given to break together are the bread of absolute trust in the mercy of God alone. When we accept to discover each anew in this sharing, doubly brother, both prodigal and pardoned, there can be a celebration among us, something of the feast ordained from all eternity to gather us together into his house. To wish to see or imagine the future is to make a fiction out of hope. And this seems to me to be doing violence to hope. Obviously, since we do not have God's imagination, when we think of the future, we think of it in terms of the past. When we are in a tunnel, we see nothing. But it is absurd to want the landscape when we come out to be the same as when we went in. Let us let the Holy Spirit do its work. It is the Spirit's business. This is what I call poverty. I will decipher it, that is, the answer to the question concerning the place of Islam in the plan of God, in the dazzling Easter light of him who presents himself to me as the only possible Muslim, because he is all yes to the will of the Father. And it's from that inspiration and my own monastic tradition that I want to set my task this morning around the word holiness. Not truth, holiness. And in my monastic tradition, the holiness that is, if you like, structured through the rule of Benedict comes out of roughly the same environment as the revelation to the Holy Prophet. We were 140 years before the Holy Prophet. And the desert tradition of monastic life, and those of you who read the writings of the Desert Fathers will know this, the emphasis is always on God, not so much on Christ. And it is that naked desire for God which is the energy of our desire for holiness. And for us, the word dialogue has to imply silence. And silence has to imply an ability to listen. It's not a negative silence. So for me, Ecclesiam Suam is important precisely because it tries to outline various elements of dialogue. But all the time, through my reading of the papal comments on the relationship between the Catholic Church and Islam, I'm always champing at the bit. Get into contemplative silence. Get into prayer. Because in that revelation, there are no boundaries. It's the one God, as Gavin gave us earlier. And when I'm talking to my students I say, we have a place where we can be together because God is one, creative, guiding, merciful, and offering a future. 4 pillars to construct a room where we can sit together and share. And listen for echo and counter-echo. To build a new spiritual memory of our relationship with God. To me, that is the foundation of a life of holiness, an environment for a life of holiness. So I want to start then saying, as I have just quoted, that Nostra Aetate paragraph is key because it gives the framework. And in my own understanding of Paul VI, I would say that he sowed a seed which was more open to dialogue. When I was young, as a young missionary, trying to be a missionary, it only lasted a year, of course, and I failed, with the White Fathers, as they were then called. But it was all about conversion. Conversion in a rather, we've got it right, you've got it wrong sense. And now, I'm waiting to be converted to become a Muslim. Not because I want to be Muslim, but because my spirituality of the rule of Benedict, and the spirituality as I understand it, and have shared it with many Muslims in different parts of the world, are one. Because they're both spiritualities of the Word. And it is that spirituality of the Word, not the same Word, but the ability to listen to a word of difference and accept difference, not as threat, but as enrichment. That, to me, is where I put my dialogue. Hence, our Latin tag, Lectio Divina, which is what I try to express with my Muslim students in our university, is key foundation of the dialogue within this house. So what about the popes? What I'm going to say is that I have always prided myself that there was a sense of continuity in churches' teaching, particularly towards the Abbot. I am looking at what the popes have said about the spirituality of dialogue, or the dialogue of spirituality, of prayer together. And I'm going to say, John Paul II takes it right up here. Benedict brings it right down there. And Francis looks as though he's bringing it up again. Some people say Timothy over-exaggerates, but I'm now going to give you a few quotations to try and develop this theme. But I'm on the level of spirituality, and I know the theologians among us will pull me apart. Monks have been pulled apart before, so it's nothing new. So let me start with a quotation from John Paul II, which was alluded to earlier. He was speaking to a Catholic community in Ankara in Turkey in 1979. As a result of this faith in God, the Creator and Transcendent, one man finds himself at the summit of creation. He was created, the Bible teaches, in the image and likeness of God. For the Quran, the sacred book of the Muslims, although man is made of dust, God breathed into him his spirit and endowed it with hearing, sight and heart. 32:8 surah. That is intelligence. We're starting to move in the direction of a spirituality because we're both somehow inspired by God. And it's one God. And it's a relating God. We then move on to another moment, 1981. He's in the Philippines. It is not right to think that in the Philippines the Muslims and Christians are really travelling, is it not right, to think that in the Philippines the Muslims and Christians are really travelling on the same ship, for better or for worse. And that in the storms that sweep across the world, the safety of each individual depends upon the effort and cooperation of all. We Christians, just like you Muslims, seek the basis and model of mercy in God himself. The God to whom your book gives the very beautiful name of Ar-Rahman, while the Bible calls him Al-Rahum, the merciful one. 1981. He's moving closer and closer in the world of spirituality. A little later, the necessity of prayer. Muslims adore the one God and associate themselves with Abraham, revering Christ and honour Mary, professing esteem for moral living, prayer and fasting. What seems to bring together and unite in a particular way Christians and the believers of other religions is the acknowledgement of the need for prayer as an expression of man's spirituality directed towards the absolute. We're getting there. Praying together before the one God. Not infrequently, a grace of prayer and contemplation is attached to life in these countries. He's speaking to the bishops of North Africa. For many Muslims, the church is the sister. They are happy to see the holiness of the church in their features. All true holiness, on another occasion, this is in 1985, comes from God, who is called the Holy One in the sacred books of Jews, Christians and Muslims. Your Holy Quran calls God Al-Qudus, as in the verse, He is God, besides whom there is no other, the sovereign, the holy, the source of peace. 59:23 in the Quran. The prophet Hosea links God's holiness with his forgiving love for mankind, a love which surpasses our ability to comprehend. I am God, not man. I am the Holy One in your midst, and have no wish to destroy. It's 11:9 in Hosea. And he repeats that again just in the same text. Be holy even as your heavenly Father is holy. And that is compared to 2:177. The Quran calls you to uprightness, to conscientious dialogue, devotion, to goodness and to virtue, which is described as believing in God, giving one's wealth to the needy, freeing captives, being constant in prayer, keeping one's word, and being patient in times of suffering. He's raising all the time on their spiritual level. He's saying a lot of other things, but he's saying this element of spirituality is important. And the classic example, which I'm sure you've all read, so I'm not going to read it. 19th of August 1985, with 100,000 Muslim students in Casablanca. He prays with them. He leads them in a beautiful prayer. O God, you are our creator. You are limitless, good and merciful. To you is due the praise of every creature, O God. You have given to us an interior law by which we should live, etc. It is just quite remarkable. But then there comes the famous First Assisi meeting. And there is some division in some areas of the Vatican about praying together or being together at prayer. Now don't forget, this was covering all world religions, and being together at prayer was the only possible way of describing it. But what interests me is that it led to the then Cardinal Ratzinger to produce in his, an essay in his book called Truth and Tolerance, Christian Belief in the World Religions, the criteria for praying with another. And his criteria, of course, let me just summarize for those of you who've forgotten it, that God is creator, one, transcendent, having a personal interest in each person, a communicating God. Fine. Second, there should be agreement about the content of the prayer, for which he suggests the Our Father would be a model. I don't think many people would be particularly worried about that. But then he goes on to say that one praying must recognize that Jesus Christ is the unique Saviour of all, is active in that prayer. Quotation, if the non-Christian should be able to see the participation of a Christian as the relativizing of faith in Jesus Christ, the Saviour of all, or be bound to see it thus, then such participation cannot take place. Well, that implies a number of previous ideas. It has been my belief that in monastic history we have had many non-Christians praying with us. And those of you who know the original monastic office, it was mainly psalms. And Christ was implied, not always explicitly there. And there is a sense in which the life of a Christian doesn't always have to explicitly state Christ in his or her prayer, in my opinion. And that is why I would challenge that third remark of Pope Benedict XVI. I haven't been able to trace it anywhere else except in that book, and since that book is not a Vatican document, infallible document, I have not regarded it as a final statement on the issue. We Benedictines are a little radical occasionally. So we have then, in the life of Pope John Paul II, a really clear attempt to build a dialogue of spirituality involving praying together, Muslims and Christians. And it is precisely in that context that when we have the time of Pope Benedict XVI, the situation changes radically. He never once, as far as I could trace, says anything about praying together, about a dialogue of spirituality with Islam. He talks a lot, quite rightly, and I'm not going to complain about it, about human rights, about the need to respect each other on the human level, about to be mutually supportive, etc. And the values of justice and or equality, etc. He's very keen that the Saudis should lift their ban on Catholic churches in Saudi Arabia, to which I say, I hope he lifts the ban on mosques in the Vatican City-State. I mean, I can see the argument, but Saudi Arabia is the holy land of Islam. Just as some Catholics would regard Vatican City-State as the holy land of the Vatican City-State. But the principle in ordinary rational terms, of course, we should have freedom of expression. But at the moment, they would regard the Saudis as a holy land, place of Mecca, Medina. So my anxiety then has always been that somehow there's been, and many Muslim people that I have met in different parts of the world have often expressed it to me, why is Benedict not so keen? Well, I can't answer that. I simply say he's different and we're all different, and he's allowed to have his theology as you're allowed to have yours. It is a problem, for me anyway. But what I am trying to get to is that with Pope Francis, it looks as though, to me, we may be getting back to the height that John Paul II, in my view, of spirituality, of shared praying together. What Christian Teixeira said in those three quotations that I gave you, and which those of you who saw the film last night, was laying a foundation to be genuinely, not just a dialogue of human living, but a dialogue of prayer. And the interaction that you saw in the film with those people coming to the monastery and picking up, and the deep sense, I didn't say it last night, but the only people who, when it was announced by the group who murdered the monks that they were dead, the only people who didn't believe it were the people of Tiberim, the Muslim people of Tiberim. They said, unless we see the evidence, we don't believe it. and then they produce the 7 heads. But they are the ones who are devastated. Christian had allowed them, it didn't come out in the film, but opposite the other side of the road where the monastery was, there was a flat area. And the people of Tiberine said, could we please construct a mosque there? And the Christian said, yeah, of course, of course. And every time the muezzin was heard calling to prayer, and the monks were at prayer, the monks stopped praying and listened in silence to the call of prayer. And when that ended, they would recommence terce, sext, known, whatever it was, morning prayer, evening prayer. The mutual respect of the spirituality of each other. In Francis's Evangelii Gaudium, I was quite interested that he does make an attempt, a good attempt, to put another slant, as Gavin said this morning. And he says this: the sacred writings of Islam have retained some Christian teachings. Jesus and Mary received profound veneration. And it is admirable to see how Muslims, both young and old, men and women, make time for daily prayer and faithfully take part in religious services. Many of them also have a deep conviction that their life in its entirety is from God and for God. They also acknowledge the need to respond to God with an ethical commitment and with mercy towards those most in need. It's laying a foundation, not just vis-à-vis the Muslims, but also to his Catholic readers. And it's quite interesting, proper formation in Islam, not only so that they can solidly and joyfully grounded in their own identity, but so they can also acknowledge the values of others, appreciate the concerns underlying their demands, and shed light on shared beliefs. We Christians should embrace with affection and respect Muslim immigrants to our countries in the same way that we hope and ask to be received and respected in countries of Islamic tradition. If I just say that I can walk around in Qom, Iran, in my habit, no one turns an eye. There's no, oh, woof, woof. Do it in the middle of London and they're all going, oh, oh. And it's quite significant in all my visits to Qom in Iran, and I've been there, 5 or 6 times, the respect they offer to you. They can ask difficult questions, indeed they do. But there's always respect, there's always hospitality, there's always place for prayer. They allow us to be with them in prayer, and they come to us while we're in prayer. And it is precisely that relationship which inspires and strengthens our dialogue. I'm not saying it's the only place. I've done it in Indonesia, I've been praying in Africa, I've done it in different parts of the world. And that is why, for me, as a monk, it is learning to insert myself in the revelation of the one God. And he then goes on another point, Pope Francis, about the immigrants should be embraced with affection and respect to our countries in the same way that we hope and ask to be received and respected in countries of the Islamic tradition. In the light of the freedom which followers of Islam enjoy in Western countries, and then he goes on, respect for true followers of Islam which lead us to avoid hateful generalizations, for authentic Islam and the proper reading are opposed to every form of violence. So, what I'm trying to say is that we are now moving back up, and I am very confident that Pope Francis is going to reignite this spirituality of remembering God, of sharing the scriptures, of listening in contemplative silence, of creating, as I say in this little book, a new spiritual memory of one for the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invite to speak at this auspicious conference. I'm really sad that I couldn't make it yesterday due to poor health. Still not fully recovered, but I will give it a go. Just to make clear that my background or expertise is not in either church history or interfaith dialogue. But I do have an interest, a personal interest in this, and sometimes do try to follow the discussions that are happening. And it's something that I'm growing more of an interest in, especially in the last few years, engaging with different people. My father's an imam, so we hear lots of discussions in the house, used to when I was younger as well. What I'm going to talk about is something that relates somewhat broadly to what Abbot Timothy was just saying. More about the Muslim reception of the church, especially kind of since Pope Paul VI. Some very brief comments to start with. In some ways, the Catholic Church is considered to be the most distant, if you like, Catholicism, the most distant to traditional Muslim belief, in the sense that if a Muslim turns up in a Catholic church, he might assume that what's happening here is idolatry. This is what people think. Also, the clerical structure and church authority might seem quite foreign to many Muslims. Although some organizations among Muslims might want to think that they do hold such authority and that their leader is the equivalent of the Muslim Pope. And I will say a bit more on this later if I get a quick chance. However, there are many traditional conservative values and beliefs that many Catholics share with many Muslims. And there is also a strong spiritual tradition common to both faiths. And Professor Ian Netton is here, and he is the expert on this matter, so I need not say any more. And his book on the topic can be consulted. And I also regret that I missed his talk yesterday as well. The honest truth is that the average Muslim perhaps cannot distinguish between the different Christian denominations, and they think that the Pope is the leader of all Christians across the globe. If you did a survey of the general Muslim youth, even here in the West that is, asking them, what is Vatican II? The majority might answer that it's the latest video game. Vatican II, Return of the Pope. A lot, therefore, needs to be done on a grassroots level, and I think in education. And I'm speaking growing up as a Muslim, visiting the mosques, talking to imams, students, and so on. And this is what I kind of garner as to be kind of the thinking what's out there. And the reason I'm saying why a lot needs to be done is because I do think the period of the Second Vatican Council is of great importance. Because before this period, as we've been discussing and we all know, a lot of mistrust existed among Muslims about the church. Largely a legacy of the Crusades and other matters. And Professor Da Costa talked about Pope Pius before in 1910, 1908. And just looking at the Catholic encyclopedia of that particular period, if you see the entry under Islam, I think it was written in 1910, quite an unflattering account of the Prophet Muhammad. And it describes Muslims, Muslim morals, and one part is what is really good in Mohammedan ethics is either commonplace or borrowed from some other religions, whereas what is characteristic is nearly always imperfect or wicked. And it also talks about the moral laxity and depraved sensualism of the Mohammedans. Take the line, Muhammad's religion, known among its adherents as Islam, contains practically nothing original. Well, they might be proud of that it's an extension of the previous revelation, but that's another matter. It is a confused combination of native Arabian heathenism, Judaism, Christianity, Sabiism, Hanifism, and Zoroastrianism. Hanifism referring to Abrahamic, the traditional historic Abrahamic faith. Now, although Pope John Paul II is considered, I would say, perhaps as a hero-like figure in many parts of the Muslim world, what we've been learning in this conference and just doing some general reading around is that perhaps much of it would not be achieved if it was not for John Paul II, and this particularly exciting and I would say pivotal period. Even if it has its origins theologically in past Christian tradition, as Professor Da Costa was pointing out, it was, I think, a watershed period or moment. And we have the Ecclesiam Suam, which I won't quote now, maybe I'll quote later, and the Nostra Aetate and so on. Very important documents. But even before the Nostra Aetate in 1964, Pope Paul had become the first pope to leave Italy in 150 years, if I've got my history right, when he made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, during which he addressed King Hussein and the beloved people of Jordan, quoting him, also greeting them in Arabic. And this was quite a distinct change from what Muslims were used to, what they were expecting from the Catholic Church, just the fact that he gave the greeting in Arabic. In 1974, the same pontiff created the Commission for Religious Relations with Muslims as a body distinct from, but part of the Pontifical Council for Non-Christians, which he had also set up. It was these movements, these activities which Pope Paul II took further, visiting many Muslim countries, including my own country of origin, Pakistan, seen very favorably, and made statements like, "We adore God and profess total submission to Him. Thus, in a true sense, we can call one another brothers and sisters in faith in the one God." And that he told to Nigerian Muslims in 1982. Not to mention that he was the first pope to enter a mosque, the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and perhaps etched in the minds of so many when he kissed the Quran. Now it's interesting when you look these things up on the internet, as I did, and seeing the responses of people who are not in favour, or we could say totally against any ideas of reconciliation. This is some Catholic voices said that he may have mistook it for the Bible. He actually thought he was kissing the Bible, and it's amazing the ignorance or the arrogance or this kind of sentiment which is completely against any idea of reaching to the other. In a quest to kind of defend their own, they actually end up insulting their own. Now in 1998, a special agreement was signed, brought into being the joint committee between the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue and the Permanent Committee of Al-Azhar for Dialogue with Monotheistic Religions. Now I could switch the same question round and say how many Muslims have heard of Vatican II, and then I could also ask how many Catholics have heard of Al-Azhar, for example. And we probably don't get a resounding answer. Basically, Al-Azhar is one of the, not the oldest, but one of the oldest universities in the Islamic, especially Sunni tradition. Very revered, although it doesn't contain the same prestige that it once had, largely due to close government affiliation, but it's still nevertheless important symbolically. As I understand, there were already contacts between the Vatican and Al-Azhar, but since this agreement in Cairo, the joint committee meets at least once a year, alternatively in Cairo and Rome. 2 years later, in the year 2000, Pope John Paul visited the house of the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar at the time, Sheikh Sayyid Tantawi. So that was also a very important moment. Not to mention his condemnation of the Iraq War. Now, it's very interesting here to see that how political events so strongly merge with religious matters, and how Muslims tend to view the church or the various popes. And I'll probably say a little bit more on that just in a moment. So John Paul II was seen as a hero-like figure in the Muslim world, especially when they look back retrospectively with the appointment of the next pope. And Abbot Timothy did touch upon this, and I don't mean to cause any offence, but particularly when he made the speech, Faith, Reason and the University, and this was on September the 12th, 2006. So a very sensitive sort of date to actually include this sort of statement, if you ask me. Anyway, you're probably all familiar with it, so I won't go through what he says, but he quotes a dialogue between a 14th century Byzantine emperor and his Persian interlocutor. quoting the emperor, he says, "Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached." Now, I know that the Pope didn't actually say that he believes this, the same thing, but it was the way that it was quoted. And the analysis, what was appended to this quote, was, trying to summarize it just to save time, is that not to act with reason is contrary to the nature of God. And how this speech was understood in the Muslim world, at least, was that because in Islam God can order irrational things, violence is something irrational, therefore God orders, can order people to do irrational things like violence. And he quotes also, as a secondary source, as I believe, Ibn Hazm. And that was very kind of strange, the way that was seen, that why he has quoted this scholar called Ibn Hazm. Now, Ibn Hazm is a follower of the Zahiri school, which is non-extant in Islam today. It's not been extant for many, many centuries. It's probably like quoting, I don't know, like the Shakers or something in Christianity. So, quoting this figure was seen as either deliberate, or why was this very obscure figure, who was a great scholar in his own right but has practically no followers in the Muslim world, used in this respect. I mean, there is a theological debate which could have been touched upon in Islamic theology, whether God is bound by justice, which was, I think, the words what the Pope used. And the difference of opinion is that some say God is bound by justice, whereas others say God is not bound by anything, but God is necessarily just. It's theological debates of terminology and so on. So anyway, there's outrage in the Muslim world, condemned by Al-Azhar, who had been making these outreaches to the church, and dialogue was continuing. Muslim parliaments across the globe, challenges for debates, some wanting more pleasant sort of dialogue. And something which I knew about personally was that in the Pakistan National Assembly, the comments were condemned, and one particular member of National Assembly, who was called Sahibzada Fazl Karim, from a descendant, a son of a great Pakistani sheikh, he actually took up the responsibility at the time and said that I will arrange for Muslim scholars, or a Muslim scholar, to engage in dialogue with the Pope on this matter. And one scholar which he, I think, actually mentioned in his speech to the National Assembly was a scholar who resides between London and Pakistan. And the responses were quite various in terms of people wanting to debate or have a dialogue with the Pope. Some wanting a more calm sort of dialogue, others wanting a debate and saying, we will show you texts from the Bible which talk about violence, we will show you crusades or church history. And it was quite upsetting at the time to see that these relations, which had been formed under the previous two popes, excluding the third short term of the third one, that the talks had actually come to this. So Al-Azhar then suspends talks with Pope Benedict after he repeatedly condemned attacks on Christians in the Middle East, especially in Egypt. Al-Azhar said that this was stoking tensions and it was not a Muslim-Christian religious conflict, and then said that the Pope should be condemning the attacks on Palestinians, and also talking about the Iraq War as well, that should be his emphasis, that he should be condemning the Iraq War and Muslim life lost there, as well as Muslim and Christian life lost in the Holy Land. Now with Pope Francis, I think a huge change has occurred already. There's that sense of change and already optimism that we are kind of going back to the area, as Abbot Timothy Wright just said, kind of in a way going back or reminding people, being reminded of the era of John Paul II. Communication with Al-Azhar started again. Al-Azhar was sent a letter from the Vatican from, well, it wasn't the Pope directly who sent the letter, so Al-Azhar wrote back and said, we would like a personal letter from the Pope, to which they responded that the Pope is too busy to write a personal letter, and this is an official letter from the Vatican. So they responded by saying, like there is only one Vatican, there is only one Al-Azhar. And like there is only one Pope, there is only one Shaykh Al-Azhar. So this is what I meant earlier on, that people, or there are organizations that do want to assume this kind of role or authority that perhaps the Pope has in Catholicism. And the Pope did write a personal letter in the end. Right. Now what's interesting is that I think also something that's been seen in the Muslim world is the fact that the Pope was not from the traditional West and was from South America, was also seen as kind of an alternative voice. Because looking back at some of these statements from, for example, the Catholic Encyclopedia, you can see there is strong parallels between that and what early Orientalists, well, not all Orientalists, but many of the Orientalists were saying about Islam as well. So what Pope Benedict was saying was kind of tied up in some senses with the Orientalist mantra that had come before. So it was reminding people of this same kind of idea of Orientalism, colonialism coming from the West. So the shift towards South America also had this effect. And the visit to Palestine and Israel was very interesting. Because I know there's been some debate, people interpreting it in different ways, every gesture being debated and read upon, and I did some reading around on this and just seeing what the media reaction to this was. And also speaking to Palestinians about what they thought about the visit. Because, like the Iraq War, I think the situation of the Palestinians is extremely sensitive. And it's necessarily bound up between how Muslims view the church's attitude towards Islam, even though it might be a political issue. I mean, there's no getting away from that. And some people, I've been to various interfaith conferences, and people think you should be able to ignore the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for a moment when we engage in these sorts of dialogues. But for most Muslims, that's actually very, very difficult to do, for reasons that probably obvious to some, or that I can't go into detail or explain right now. What people saw was that the Pope was siding with those that were oppressed, especially when he made this kind of unscheduled stop at the wall, where he made this prayer. I mean, some people were reading the hand just as a prayer on the wall, but some people were seeing it as a kind of a spiritual gesture to try to break the wall, as if he was trying to shift this wall out of its place and that it should not belong here. So this idea of oppression and suffering was strongly resonating with people. Now, although this was a kind of a political visit, it had a spiritual effect as well, and this is touching on the idea of spirituality. And a Vatican spokesperson actually did call it a profound spiritual moment. So I think the link between politics and spirituality, or oppression and spirituality, was quite strong at this particular moment. The Palestinians, the Christian Palestinians that welcomed the Pope, were singing songs about Palestinian freedom, religious Christian songs about Palestinian freedom. And they were linking their suffering to the suffering of Jesus. And also had, if you saw the images, an image of Jesus Christ wrapped in a Palestinian keffiyeh. Now, although some of these may be seen as political gestures, among Christians it was seen as something very profoundly spiritual, and it was also seen as profoundly spiritual for Muslims as well, which is very interesting. Although this was a Christian gathering, Christian songs being sung, the audience was Christian, but it was also seen as something profoundly spiritual for Muslims, in that the way the Pope had recognized, as they saw, or had participated, shared in this feeling of oppression that existed among the Palestinians. And this is quite interesting, coming back to, just going to finish off here in the last few minutes, that if you follow some of the discourses on interfaith dialogue written by Muslim theologians and how they've discussed it, one of the common things that they talk about is that we should be engaging with other religions, especially Christians and Jews, due to the tradition of the Abrahamic faith, or the so-called Abrahamic faith, in shared values and commonalities. And one of those things that strongly comes out in many of the writings you'll see is fighting against oppression and combating oppression. Combating evil, injustice, these sorts of themes are very, very strong, and there's a strong encouragement to actually recognize that Muslims and Christians together should work to combat these different evils that exist in the world. Along with this then, you also see issues of morality that are also being discussed. So shared morals and ethics among Muslims and Christians should be focused on. And this is quite interesting for me, especially because these shared values and ethics now are being recognized in both traditions, where perhaps before each tradition was seen as an enemy of the other. If you look back again at this Catholic encyclopedia and you compare that with the Ecclesiam Suam and Nostra Aetate, there's a great shift in where the Muslims are seen as people with not only inferior morals, but with heathenism and so on, to an appreciation, in fact, and I'll quote Nostra Aetate here, where it says, finally, they value the moral life and worship God, especially through prayer, almsgiving and fasting. So what we see here is that shared values and ethics, or the moral life of Muslims, is actually being praised here. And this is not too different from the Quran, and Timothy Abbot was talking about this, where the spirituality and morality of Christians is praised explicitly in the Quran. So what we can see here is that politics, social issues, have a strong link with spirituality, and that common cause in terms of trying to arrive at that spirituality is shared among both Muslims and Christians. And also it seems that directly the spiritual prayers and worship of Christians and Muslims is seen as common ground among both traditions. So I'll just finish on there, and just to finish off, I will quote one thing from the Ecclesiam Suam. Well, I won't quote it, I'll just mention it. One of the things interestingly mentioned in there, when it talks about working with other faiths, is I think it's something like combating the growing evil of atheism. The language used is quite strong, but that language is so strikingly similar to discourses on dialogue with other religions among Muslim scholars. I mean, even people like, for example, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who talks about, who's seen as a controversial figure in the West for different reasons. But even if you look at something like his work on dialogue with other religions, one of the things that stands out in there is a line which is so similar, and the description of it, to the Ecclesiam Suam. So I think there's many shared areas where Muslims and Christians can work, and all I hope is that with the new Pope, with Pope Francis, that this kind of shared optimism will hopefully bear fruit. Thank you very much.
I'm now going to invite both speakers to make any comments they want to about what they've heard from the other.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I'd like to start by trying to tease out from what you've said the relationship between what I call the religious Islam, Sunni Shia, and politics. I did 3 months in Tantor in Jerusalem several years ago, so I've walked the wall and seen all that. I visited several other different Muslim countries, and one of the things that I'm never very clear on, partly because where I'm living now, the Muslims are, in a sense, apolitical. That doesn't mean to say they don't have political issues, but they're not a political force as such, in a way that they would be in a Muslim majority country. And what I'm trying to tease out is precisely where the theology and spirituality of Islam is, to what extent is linked to the state, i.e. the social political environment, or is that just a historical accident?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think, many points, it's extremely important to distinguish the politics from the religion, and we're all quite clear on how the abuse of religion can take place at the hands of politics and politicians. But speaking traditionally from an Islamic point of view, I mean, Islam does not like to make a distinction between religion and politics, and I think that's one of the ways where the Islamic world finds itself at odds with the modern Western world, with the separation of church and state. In that even it's accepted in the Western world today, but in the Muslim world, among many Muslims, I mean, some people now, given the Arab Spring and so on, more people probably, or the numbers are increasing of those individuals that probably would like a separation between church and state, and this debate in Iran is quite strong. But on the whole, I would say, especially among the religious classes, a separation between religion and state is still not something that's envisaged, and it's something that's actually completely frowned upon. Currents of people asking for Sharia is still very dominant in the Muslim world, despite the counter-revolution in the Arab Spring. So this separation in the first place does not really exist from a theological perspective, even though religion has been abused throughout Islamic history for its politicians and their own ends. The issue of the Palestinian conflict is very interesting, because for some people they may not be engaged so politically in the Palestinian conflict, but they do find a sense of kind of spiritual attachment to what is happening, in the sense of spiritual attachment to general oppression. And I think what's happened is, and I've known people as well, and again, just personal experience from seeing people have actually become more interested in religion or faith or Islam as a result of, say, the Palestinian conflict or conflicts elsewhere. So as a result of seeing this particular oppression, it has really influenced their whole view of life, of religion and of faith. And I also think, and I think the Palestinian context is very, very interesting, because when you see there, when they actually become more involved in the discussions and what's happening, they actually see beyond that. It's not only an issue affecting Muslims or Islam, but there are Christians who are suffering the same way as many Muslims are. So then they start finding this idea about kind of how oppression is also shared amongst people. And it allows them, in a way, to see and engage with other people, perhaps in a way that they wouldn't be able to do if they just picked up the Bible and tried to learn about Christianity. But when they see it through that lens, or when they visit, or when they perhaps see things on the media, it completely changes their perspective. And sometimes that can be a strong, positive route for people into engaging in dialogue with the other. And I think on that note, I'd probably want to push a question back to you on this idea of holiness. And I really like the idea of not truth but holiness, and I think this is quite common, just thinking on your comment, trying to absorb it in the Quran as well, and in the Muslim tradition, how holiness has always been inspired wherever it's found. And in this sense, would you also think that in terms of activism, and I just remembered something else actually as well, that the Al-Azhar and the Vatican signed a joint partnership of some sort in combating slavery, for example. Yeah, something I was reading, which is very interesting. I mean, absolutely excellent. And this is the sort of thing that really gets me interested in this sort of stuff outside of what I do in my kind of academic life, which is mainly Islamic jurisprudence. That we all have a responsibility, whatever we're doing in our own lives, to look at these injustices and problems in the world and see how we can work together. So something like that is absolutely remarkable. And there's no reason why in this partnership to combat slavery that cannot be grounded completely in a sense of spirituality and holiness. So I'd just like to see maybe what you've got to say on that.
Thank you for that. Am I right in saying that you would, I use the word human trafficking, that's what you mean by slavery? That's fine. I quote and all use quite frequently the phrase of Jesus, who said in the discussion about the Last Judgment, when you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it to me. So every human being, not just wherever they're coming from, for whatever age and whatever condition and whatever belief, is Jesus. And in that, then you say, oh, how can you think that Hitler is Jesus? Or how can you think that a rabid atheist is Jesus? Because the very sense of being human transcends behaviour. And too often we live in particularly as I pick it up in our work, we live in a society which is very good at condemning behaviour and not so good at looking at the motive behind it and the social situation, the economic situation which may cause it. So for me, once you say that every human being is Jesus, that is a spiritual encounter. I may not like the person, we may speak a different language, we may even worship a different God, but we can hold hands together and we can say please and thank you. So at that level is where, to me, where spirituality starts. And when you say holiness, when I ask a question about holiness, I'm always reminded of what I said last night in the presentation of the film, of the story of Christian de Chergé's conversion, which you may, I will repeat again because there may be people who don't know it. When Christian was doing his national service in the French army in Algeria, he was responsible for what they call community relations. And he formed a friendship with a local man called Mohammed, who they used to go on walks together. And on one occasion, after several they established this friendship, suddenly out of the bushes, this man came out and pointed a gun at Christian. Mohammed came between the two of them and said to the young man, you don't shoot this man, he is a good man. So the man was killed. The next morning, Mohammed was found dead, with his throat slit, father of 7 children. And Christian always held that Mohammed was his saviour. And right up until his dying, to the last moment, he regarded that was the ground of the selfless giving of life on behalf of the other. And that is where, in a sense, you have meeting the other, a spirituality and holiness.
I think that's an excellent comment. And just to respond to that, we have something quite similar in a sense, or something that we can relate to in the Sufi tradition, especially in the writings of Sufi scholars such as Ibn Arabi, who talks about this concept of the oneness of God or the unity of God. And it's this concept that everything actually is a manifestation of God. And you have this concept of he, not he. So the he with the capital H is that aspect of all human beings which allows us to see the manifestation of God in them. And the not he, which is, you could say, is the behavioral aspects, which allow us to ignore certain aspects of particular human beings, is also something that we encounter with people that we see. So in many ways, I mean, and this is what some scholars are working on and have worked on already as well in the past, is that the kind of theology of Ibn Arabi and people like him in that same kind of spiritual tradition allow us to take our encounter with human beings or different religions from one of mere, let's say, recognition perhaps, to one of acceptance. And I think that's where a lot of the challenge lies, to trying to take it to that one step further in some of the ways that you've just actually discussed in these various stories. So there's quite a lot, I think, in both traditions where the emphasis needs to be put where there's unique aspects in both traditions, but that can come together to form a kind of synergy, I think, where each thing is looked upon.
One of the things that I developed in the book was that looking at the mystical tradition, Benedictine Muslim, tracing the two journeys to the union with God, at the top end of that, the language is the same.
Now, it's a chance now for some of you to ask things. Kevin?
Yes, Archbishop Kevin MacDonald. I want to speak about Pope Benedict. It was in this room, as you know, that Pope Benedict greeted the members of other religions. He was standing quite near to other speakers who spoke this morning, though a couple of feet higher because of the podium here. And in his talk, he didn't talk about praying together, but he made a very, very generous statement when he was talking about dialogue, in the sense that he thought it was very important that, as well as a theological dialogue, the people of different religions should come together to share their experience of divine love. And it's a very important statement because of an affirmation that prayer in other religions is actually an engagement with divine love. And secondly, on the Regensburg thing, which I remember very vividly because I had to face Kirsty Walker on Newsnight about it, and I didn't then know whether he was going to say he did or didn't agree with the emperor. But I think it's important to note the aftermath of that, which was that a lot of scholars, as I'm sure you know, wrote this document called A Common Word, which was a Muslim program for interreligious dialogue, a kind of Muslim Nostra Aetate. And out of that grew the Catholic Muslim Forum, which I went to a session of in Jordan a couple of years ago, and that has been very fruitful. Just a little bit of redressing here.
Do either of you want to respond to that?
Yes, I only want to say one thing. Paradoxically, I was invited to be part of the Archbishop of Canterbury's response to a common word between us, and it was called the Common Word for the Common Good. And we met in Cambridge, and there were, must have been 3 or 4 Catholics among the team, his team. But what was interesting for me was that was the most senior, the gathering of the most senior Muslim scholars ever to meet in the United Kingdom. And when I contacted my people, because some of them also were part of the forum, or the equivalent, the sense among them was huge deflation. That in their terms, the Vatican had misplayed the whole thing from beginning to end. And the very start, when the first letter of the 27, which they told me received no reply from the Vatican, and therefore there was a sense always on the back foot. And although they were glad to take part in the forum, and I knew the people there, and I attended the final meeting of their first meeting in Rome, the feeling was very much more lower down. In other words, less enthusiastic, and I thought that was sad.
Thank you. Ivana.
Thank you. Ivana Noble from Prague. Thank you very much for both of your contributions, which I have enjoyed very much. I think your emphasis on holiness reminded me of a story probably 17 years back when I traveled from a conference from Antwerp to Prague by an overnight bus. And the bus was full of workers, immigrants, and I was the only woman on the bus. And at one point I fell asleep and the bus stopped, and when I woke up there was somebody else's coat over me, so that I would feel warm. And then there was a man who came to me and who brought me a Mars bar, saying, "You must be hungry." And this man was a young Muslim man, and we spent the rest of the journey talking afterwards, and he told me that as he saw me there, he thought of me as his sister, and what he would want to do for his sister, and he did it for me. This was a very moving time for me, and I think one or two encounters where I could encounter some elements of human holiness from the other. And I think I wanted to ask both of you whether it would be helpful perhaps to translate also the call to holiness in terms of wholeness. And especially to you, Dr. Mustafa, what would be the Islamic image behind that? When we read the Psalms and we emphasize the wholeness of the human heart, or that sort of we should act wholeheartedly as whole human beings, what would be the equivalent to that would translate maybe the holiness to some people to more accessible categories, when they would feel that they are not yet there, but perhaps they can be, at least in some occasions, whole human beings. Thank you.
Thank you for that very moving comment. Just one word on the story that you mentioned. One of the things that I found is that one of the most powerful forces in engagement, or allowing people to engage with other faiths and other people of other religions, is that aspect of human interaction that you mentioned. I mean, the personal experience that you have with other human beings can have such a profound effect that all the kind of stereotypes or negativities and biases that one has can be washed away in seconds. For me, probably the most powerful thing has been the human interaction, visiting and seeing other people, meeting other people, more so than reading or trying to engage with other means. Just very quickly on your question about wholeness, I think you mentioned. Again, I would. There is quite a lot we can say from the Quran and from the prophetic life as well. But just to try to summarise that, I'd probably go back again to the mystical and spiritual tradition, again of Ibn Arabi, who does not see things in divisions and in separate entities. Quite common in the spiritual tradition is that they see not only an individual human being, but all of humanity as one existence, basically, that cannot be separated physically or metaphysically, and in a spiritual sense, that this division is actually not possible for them to do. And the mystical tradition in Islam is very strong in that particular sense, and it's something that maybe you should try to look up and engage more with.
No. Right. Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the talk. I teach Christian Muslim relations at Heathrow, so it was really interesting hearing what you had to say. You were right to look at the Catholic Encyclopedia, is it 1908? Time ago, and to see some rather disparaging remarks about Islam and indeed other religions. I think if you went into a Catholic bookshop today, you would see only very, very positive coverage about Islam and other religions. And that's one of the, I think, the great achievements of the theological turnabout that you talked about so openly. Let me throw the ball into your own court. If I go into a Muslim bookshop in most mosques, I don't see that. I see very typical Islamic tradition about Islam, about Christianity being an abrogated religion, about our scriptures having been tampered with and not being genuine, and about our central doctrines being very dangerously far from the truth. You were sounding very positive about contemporary Islamic theology. You mentioned Al-Qaradawi. I hope you're not going to sort of quote him on the Dimon restoration. Do you see any positive movements in contemporary Islamic theology that can sort of mirror that positive turnabout in theology appraisal of, say, Christianity?
Yeah, that's a good and fair question. If you looked at the same period in the Muslim world, or even if you look today, you would find similar statements about Christianity or other religions. There's no doubting that. What I tried to say was that I think a shift is also taking place in the Muslim world. What I think happened during the period of the Second Vatican Council was that the Church caught on to the fact that the world is changing. It's a different place, a more globalized world. There's much more interaction. Saw that the commonalities we have in the Muslim world, in fact, are more than the commonalities we have with many people in the Western world. So that sensualism and that deprived ethical character that was once ascribed to the Muslims now has shifted to materialistic people in the Western world, which is quite clear. And that's why I find it quite fascinating when I was reading the document that the basis on which to engage with Muslims now is worship of God, worship of the one God, so they're not atheists, and it's common ethical moral values, which was the complete opposite before this period. That's what I was trying to stress. So they are finding more commonalities with people in the Muslim world than they are in the Western world for many reasons. And that for me is also happening in the Muslim world now. So things are changing. It's like, in a sense, who is the bigger enemy, or it's out of necessity even. So things will change either out of necessity, and then from that, then it will probably turn into a labour of love, I think, to some degree. That's already happening. There is work already happening among more of the academics, but it is, I would agree to some extent, it's still slow, but it is changing. I think that it is changing in the Muslim world, and the problem has been identified and recognised. It's more difficult sometimes for people in the Islamic world when they're surrounded only by Muslims and they don't see a problem of perhaps atheism to the same degree as it's been seen in the West, but they do see problems of like materialism and other issues where they might find more common ground with Christian brethren. So I think they're also going to catch on to the changing world and recognise those commonalities rather than differences.
I'd just like to make a very quick comment on it's happened to me in several of the meetings that I've had of interreligious, that leaders from both the Christian and Muslim side have said, when any one of your community write about us, 80% of it is usually wrong, and vice versa. In other words, they were pleading that if a Christian was to write about Islam, I'm not talking about the top scholars, but the people who produce a lot of popular books on Islam, they should have it checked before they publish it to make sure it is right, and vice versa.
Very, very half a sentence, well, one sentence. I think that tension is still there. It remains and is a challenge between religious dogma, professing your own religious faith, and the idea of dialogue, which was really excellently discussed by Professor De Costa. I think that challenge still does remain for many Muslims of how they kind of interact with the two ideas.
Are there any other questions? Steve.
Steve Bullen, St Mary's University. I'm fear I'm in danger of committing the great conference question sin, which is to take a very small bit that one of the speakers said to then kind of hang my own standard agenda onto it. But I was very struck by what Mustafa said right at the end about Ecclesiam Suam's comments on atheism and the very negative things that Paul has to say there, and he has some nice, constructive, positive things in there too. But I mean, the issue of politics has come up several times in this conference, both yesterday with Father Robin and today talking about Israel and Palestine, setting the kind of the context in which dialogue takes place. And I'm very alive to the fact that obviously Paul is suggesting dialogue with atheists in the mid-60s. He's also, with the same document, trying to reinvigorate dialogue with the Orthodox, and he can't ignore the plight of the Orthodox within the Soviet Union while saying nice things about atheists. You have to strike that balance for the sake of ecumenism. And it struck me as you were speaking that, of course, it wasn't just the Orthodox who were persecuted in the Soviet Union. There were very significant areas which were, of course, majority Muslim, not just in Central Asia, but in Europe, in Albania, also. And again, I just wonder whether Paul sits with alive to some of those political sensitivities, not just in terms of ecumenical dialogue, but again in terms of interreligious dialogue with Jews and Muslims. So just a comment, really.
Just very briefly, actually, I think that's a very good observation. And the issue with exactly as you mentioned in the Soviet Union. Again, that's something that comes out quite clearly in Muslim interfaith kind of theory or dialogue with other religions, especially looking at these sorts of areas where they would see this as something completely at home with what they want to actually, or what they see interfaith dialogue, what the purpose of interfaith dialogue is for them. Something where they see this persecution happening on both to their own and to the other is something where they should be working together on. And that's quite prominent, I think, in the theory. And the atheism one is interesting because in the Muslim world, I mean, in the Western world today, the way you talk about atheism is quite different, perhaps even to the 60s. Whereas in the Muslim world, generally speaking, it's actually, if you read Ecclesiam Suam, where it says about atheism, they're probably quite at home with that, actually, quite comfortable with the sort of wording, and would see atheism in the words that was described in there. And the tension that you talk about, again, is something I think that's occurring a lot in Muslim discourses of interfaith. That same tension again exists where you want to engage in dialogue at the same time, but at the same time you've got certain kind of safeguarded issues which you can't really concede on because of what that will mean to people or the masses that you're actually presenting the word to.
Time for one final question.
I'm John Woodhouse. I'm from Westminster Cathedral Interfaith Group. And I'm just thinking about a year ago when Archbishop Kevin and I both went to the Woolwich Mosque as a result of a terrible murder. And I just think that on that occasion, the media's reaction is very interesting. We were all gathered in a room, we were photographed, we got onto the 6 o'clock news at BBC News, but by 10 o'clock news we were off. So what was actually a good thing simply disappeared. And I think this is very important. Sometimes the sheer mere presence of actually being there with our Muslim friends is very, very important. But the world out there doesn't want to know that. And I think we need to put that into context. That's my comment.
Okay.
So very final, very quick thing. Sorry. On Pope Benedict issue, I was going to make a comment that I think there were Muslims in the, I think it was the common word again. When Pope Benedict apologised, some people saw it as apology, some people didn't see it as a direct enough apology. But then there were a group of scholars attached to the common word that did accept the apology and said they would like to move on for it, and they believe sincerely that the Pope regretted his comments and that it was now time to move on and look forward to further dialogue. But I do see that was seen differently among different Muslims.
Okay. I think the fact that there are still people who would like to enter into this conversation suggests the quality of what we've had this morning. So could I invite you to thank our speakers again?
And thank you, Lynne. Lynne is, she hasn't been introduced, but Lynne is really, she is the interfaith dialogue of St Mary's University. And so we're very grateful to you. Let's give a round of applause. Timothy, we have filmed this dialogue, so we hope to put this on the website. So to all our viewers, God bless you all. Also, I'm going to abuse my position again and big it up for Pope Benedict. If it wasn't for Pope Benedict standing here, we wouldn't be here today, because this dialogue session comes directly out of Pope Benedict's very wonderful initiative here at St Mary's. So I at least am grateful, and I say if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be here today.